So, who acts to stabilize the economy during extreme downturns? In the United States, there are two major macroeconomic policymakers, including the Federal Reserve and the federal government. Here we have an image of President Donald Trump and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. So, just what do these two individuals do and how do they do it? And what lets them know they need to do something? There are two major entities that can interrupt downturns in the economy and convert them back to more favorable conditions. Here we have a representative of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, who stepped down in February of 2018, and a representative of the U.S. federal government, President Donald Trump. So it turns out that macroeconomics centers upon the policymaking of the Federal Reserve and the federal government. See, when these two individuals wake up in the morning, they are tasked with looking at the United States as a whole. You and I, we wake up in the morning and we think about our families and think about what we're going to have for lunch and what we're going to do after school. But there are certain individuals that have far more responsibilities than that. And they look at our economy to determine what the conditions are at any given time. And like an automobile, our economy can be moving too fast or can be running too slow, neither of which condition is desirable. See, we want the economy to move at a steady pace, around 65 miles an hour. Metaphorically speaking, the economy should increase in its GDP by about 2 to 3%, create a little inflation every year, which is a representation of economic activity, and have a fully employed economy of around 5 to 6% unemployment. So how do they know? How do they know if the economy is where it should be? It turns out we have a way to illustrate this through what's known as the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Today we're going to look at this model in a very basic way. In a subsequent video, we're going to look at the more sophisticated graph. So what does the word aggregate actually mean? In economics, or in other contexts, we use the word aggregate to represent the sum of all demand, the sum of all supply. So where does the demand or the aggregate demand come from in a macroeconomy? It comes from basically anybody that would buy American-made products. So consumers and businesses and government and maybe foreigners. And where does the aggregate supply come from? Well, it comes from the ability to produce those products. So when we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, what we're talking about is the total production or the total purchased U.S. products. Again, aggregate means the sum of all. So let's take a look at the basic aggregate supply and demand model as we work our way to the more complete model. Let's indicate first what's on the X and Y axis. In this model, whether it's the basic model or the more in-depth model, the total amount of all things that are produced is on the X axis. The Y-axis represents the price level, or the overall price level in an economy. In the basic model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we have again a aggregate demand curve that represents the total amount of demand in the market, and we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which represents the capacity to produce American-made products. At the equilibrium point, we have an equilibrium price level where prices are relatively in balance at around 2 to 3%. And we have an equilibrium level of output, which represents about 5 to 6% unemployment. So again, where does aggregate demand originate from? Well, the term aggregate means the sum of all. So it is the sum of all consumption spending, government spending, business spending, known as investment spending, and foreign spending, minus the spending we do on foreign goods. And this curve is a downward sloping curve. As you can see, this yellow aggregate demand curve slopes downwards to represent the idea that when American products are less expensive, consumers, business, government, and foreigners will buy more, and vice versa. But again, aggregate demand represents the total demand in the market, which comes from the C, the I, the G, and the NX. What about aggregate supply? What determines if we can produce more or less of a given good? Well, it's essentially the factors of production. See, any economy needs machines or capital, factories, the ability to produce based on capital goods. Every economy needs natural resources such as corn or wheat. Economies must have workers, and every economy needs entrepreneurs or people that are willing to bring the product to the market. So, ultimately, the factors of production illustrate to us what gives us the capacity to produce. So, on this slide, we can see once again the characteristics of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the market. I've got my consumers, government, business spending, and foreign spending to make up my aggregate demand. To characterize aggregate supply, we have the machines or the capital, the natural resources or land, the workers, also known as laborers, and our business people or entrepreneurs. So that about wraps it up for our basic introduction of aggregate supply and aggregate demand.